On the morning of April 29, 1945, US soldiers pushed open the gates of Dachau. They expected a prisoner of war camp. Instead, they found mass grave, emaciated survivors, and the remnants of a killing machine that had operated since 1933. In 2025, for the first time, complete records confirm the full scope. 206,206 men, women, and children passed through Dachau, and 41,561 were killed within its walls. For decades, estimates were fragments drawn from testimony and incomplete files. Now, with newly declassified archives, the scale of suffering stands beyond doubt. But even before Dachau, American forces in April 1945 were entering battles that would test them in ways they had not anticipated. Crossing into the final battlefield April 1945. The march into Bavaria brought with it an entirely different kind of danger. With Germany visibly collapsing, American commanders and soldiers alike expected surrender to come quickly. Instead, they found themselves entering a countryside where order had disintegrated into something unpredictable. Ambushes, sabotaged buildings, hidden mines scattered through farmland. The struggle ahead would not resemble the sweeping maneuvers of earlier campaigns, but a slower, uneven fight across towns and valleys filled with unseen hazards. Rumors circulated among the troops of Hitler's so-called Alpine Redoubt, a fortress buried in the mountains where the regime's most loyal forces, supported by hidden stockpiles of weapons, would stage a final stand. These warnings carried weight. High command in both Washington and at SHAEF chose to redirect advancing units southward, wary of strongholds hidden in the Alps. Diaries kept by battalion leaders show orders issuing sharp notices. Be ready for fortified caverns, for concealed bunkers rigged with explosives, even for chemical weapons. Many of these threats never materialized, but their shadow darkened every mile of the advance. A quiet pasture or a narrow track could conceal the approach to a fortified cave, and soldiers moved under the constant suspicion that the next ridge held more than it revealed. The terrain itself deepened this unease. Bavaria's narrow mountain roads limited the armor columns, forcing convoys into single paths where a disabled vehicle could halt the advance entirely. Forests pressed close to the routes, ideal for snipers or concealed machine guns. Farmhouses, barns, and even mills had been wired to detonate, turning potential shelters into traps. Combat engineers, moving alongside or even ahead of the infantry, had to sweep roads for planted charges, probe rafters for grenades tied by tripwires to doors, and secure bridges already rigged with explosives. Each village or isolated building required hours of scrutiny. A place could seem harmless one day, only to explode underfoot the next, and soldiers learned to distrust every doorway or path. Archival records made public in 2025 shed clearer light on how damaging these traps were. Previous accounts of the Bavarian campaign emphasized firefights and urban skirmishes. The new reports show that losses from accidents, mines, and demolitions had been undercounted, with injuries from these sources forming a significant share of total casualties in the final advance. Men were frequently pulled from the line due to shrapnel from booby traps, collapsing structures, or burns from sudden explosions. The impact was immediate. Experienced non-commissioned officers disappeared from their companies overnight, leaving fresh replacements to shoulder responsibilities with little preparation. Even as German military formations dissolved, these irregular dangers inflicted steady attrition that official communiques had rarely acknowledged. The danger extended beyond the soldiers. Civilians, trying to return to farms or move through the ruins of their towns, entered areas still seeded with mines or unstable structures. Farmers re-entering their barns or families rooting through debris stumbled into detonations planted weeks before. Children searching for food sometimes picked up unexploded ordnance. American engineers attempted to cordon off villages while they cleared these hazards, but progress was uneven, and in many areas civilians were left to navigate danger on their own. Reports describe hungry livestock wandering untended through streets, wells fouled either by retreating German forces or simple neglect, and houses gutted by demolitions. For those who survived bombardment, the danger of routine daily life had become lethal. Columns of surrendering prisoners offered only partial reassurance. US troops often encountered groups of young conscripts and elderly men shuffling along roads after handing in their weapons, suggesting the fight was all but finished. Yet within hours, patrols would still encounter bursts of sniper fire or concealed ambushes from small teams of Volkssturm or SS elements unwilling to quit. What seemed one moment to be the winding down of a war could, without warning, return to sudden violence. These meetings blurred the very concept of a defined front line. Resistance no longer formed walls of defense across territory. It came scattered, fragmented, timed to strike without warning and fade away into the countryside. Supply difficulties compounded the strain. Thawing spring weather softened roads into mud that trapped convoys and left artillery in ditches. Heavy trucks bogged down, breaking lines of support to the infantry fringing ahead. Retreating German units ensured the disruption was worse by demolishing culverts and bridges, littering roads with obstacles that slowed every forward movement. In a single week of April, scattered reports recorded hundreds of detonated culverts and collapsed roadbeds. Each crossing and path demanded deliberate inspection before armor or supply could pass. Haste risked collapse or concealed explosives, but delay invited isolation. The campaign moved forward, but always haltingly, never as fast as soldiers had imagined when they first crossed into Bavaria. The disconnection between Germany's collapsing central command and the stubbornness of scattered resistance created a tense, brittle atmosphere. Over weeks of advancing south, the dreaded Alpine Redoubt proved not to exist as a coherent fortress. Historians note that while tunnels and storage facilities had been built in parts of the Alps, the elaborate cave stronghold of intelligence rumors was more imagined than real. But the absence of such a structure did not ease the psychological strain. American soldiers lived with the conviction that it could appear at any turn. Every cavern mouth or fortified ridge might be its beginning. The failure of these fears to materialize never lessened the grip they held while the march was underway. The realities shown in the updated documentation draw a sharper picture than earlier histories. Losses from unconventional hazards were grossly understated at the time. Engineers and infantry alike encountered an environment where progress hinged on dismantling hidden dangers, not just defeating armed opponents. Civilians endured the same threats: hunger, displacement, and the random cruelty of destroyed infrastructure. If victory seemed near, it was layered with constant reminders that random chance, an unseen wire, a collapsing roof, a late ambush, could make any step deadly. In this final stage of the conflict, the experience of battle was scattershot, never steady, marked by bursts of violence and repeated interruption. And as the Americans pressed further, they entered places where resistance was not just hidden in fields or barns, but entrenched in cities already devastated by fire and bombs. It was here, in urban ruins, where command insisted on last stands, even against hopeless odds, that the campaign's steady tension erupted into days of brutal street fighting. The Siege of Nuremberg. Nuremberg became the next great test, as German leaders issued uncompromising orders to defend the city regardless of its condition. By April 1945, the Reich was in disarray, its armies shattered, its leaders drifting from desperation to delusion, and its cities reduced to smoking ruins. Yet here, in a place already carved open by months of bombing, came a directive to resist until the last man. To German command, Nuremberg was not simply another urban position. It was the symbolic heart of the regime, the stage where mass rallies had once projected power to the world. Losing it meant more than surrendering ground. It meant revealing, in front of both enemies and citizens, that even the sight of the Nazi spectacle could collapse into ashes. The fight that followed lasted 5 days. American tanks entering the north and west of the city quickly found themselves confined to narrow corridors of rubble. Whole blocks had been turned into defensive layers of stone and dust, where basements became machine gun nests and stairwells were rigged with explosives. Volunteers of the Volkssturm, Many of them men too old for regular service or boys pulled from classrooms, were thrust into these positions with outdated rifles, Panzerfausts, or little training. Civilians conscripted in haste were forced to carry weapons into combat they had no chance of surviving. For US infantry companies, used to smaller skirmishes and rapid surrenders, this abrupt turn to hardened defense was jarring. Vehicles edging down tight alleys were struck by sudden volleys from hidden positions, forcing troops to advance door to door, clearing each cellar with grenades or satchel charges. The street-by-street struggle erased any sense of predictability and drained momentum at a punishing pace. The physical state of the city intensified the ordeal. Months of bombing had reduced 90% of Nuremberg to rubble, with collapsed roofs forming barricades and toppled masonry blocking every major route. Bulldozers were pulled forward to carve temporary paths for supply and armor, while thick smoke settled in pockets across the city. Fires often reignited as fighting spread deeper into residential districts. American engineers laid charges to destroy fortified cellars, but every demolition added to the ruin, bringing more walls down and trapping more civilians beneath. The city's old stone churches, warehouses, and historic bridges, many having survived earlier waves of bombing, buckled during these close-range engagements. What had once been a proud medieval center became shapeless ground contested block by block. Archival releases from 2025 have updated the civilian toll, making clear just how costly these 5 days were for ordinary residents. The verified figure now stands at 371 civilians killed during the siege. Earlier speculations had projected much higher numbers, but incomplete wartime records and destroyed registries created decades of uncertainty. Even with the revised total, the deaths of those days left a heavy scar. Many perished in collapsing shelters when fresh bombardments shook foundations. Others died from failed medical support as hospitals stood gutted and without supplies. Families unable to flee the fighting huddled in cellars and quickly ran out of water and food, while fires and choking dust made hiding places unlivable. For the city's weakest, the sick, the elderly, and children, survival was often beyond reach. For the Americans, the rhythm of the battle felt unpredictable. At times, entire groups of German soldiers appeared willing to surrender, hands lifted as weapons clattered to the ground. Mere hours later, the same unit would come under attack by fanatical fighters who fired from rooftops or launched Panzerfaust strikes from stairways. Teenagers positioned in clock towers or churches targeted isolated patrols, while small squads of SS men pushed conscripts to stand fast. What prolonged the fight was not the promise of reinforcement. None was coming, but the political will from above that forbade capitulation. Radios carried propaganda still clinging to fantasies of miracle weapons and Alpine arsenals. Residents, meanwhile, were caught in the crossfire, unable to distinguish one day's battlefield from the next, living in spaces where any street could abruptly turn into a line of fire. The destruction in these days consumed the last remains of the city's heritage. Already devastated by previous bombing raids, Nuremberg still retained fragments of its centuries-old architecture. Half-timbered houses, stone-spanned bridges, Gothic churches. Yet in the final fighting, they too fell. Shells that collapsed one defensive position often toppled nearby structures that had survived months of raids. Centuries of craft and culture disappeared as these buildings crumbled into indistinguishable ruin. When American troops finally secured the city center, the skyline bore little trace of the historic place that had once stood proudly across Europe. The loss was not just material, it was cultural and symbolic, erasing physical reminders of a past that predated the Nazi spectacle. Camera crews were present through much of the siege, tasked with documenting what American forces encountered. Under the guidance of Hollywood director George Stevens and the Army's Special Film Project 186, these teams used 16 color film to capture both combat operations and the state of devastation. Their footage showed armored columns creeping past mounds of stone, soldiers picking their way through tangled wreckage, and groups of women and children standing, disoriented in open spaces churned by artillery. The color images made visible details that black and white concealed. Dust-stained uniforms, orange flames curling through rubble, pallid expressions on civilians who had lost everything. The material was used not as propaganda alone, but as a clear record of fighting inside the symbolic heart of Nazi Germany and the human ruin it left behind. The logic of fighting for Nuremberg remained tenuous. Strategically, holding the city produced no gain. No reinforcements could save it. No hidden vault of supplies existed to resupply its dwindling defenders, and no Alpine fortress materialized to extend the war. What the stubborn defense accomplished was instead destruction. German units were consumed, American soldiers carried fresh wounds, entire districts were obliterated, and civilians bore lasting trauma. In retrospect, it was an act driven less by tactics than by symbols, fueling more ruin for no real delay of defeat. For the Americans, the 5 days in Nuremberg offered stark proof that final victories required not just declarations, but relentless, measured action in claustrophobic environments that exacted an exhausting cost. For civilians living through it, the siege proved again that in those final weeks, leadership valued the preservation of myth above human survival. With the fighting over, Nuremberg lay stripped of its identity, its streets lined with wreckage, its residents deeply scarred, its landmarks erased in fire and stone dust. The casualty numbers, updated at last, show the scale more precisely, even as the experience itself cannot be fully measured in statistics. To American troops moving on from the ruins, the conquest of the city was less a triumph than a reminder of what a society in collapse produced. Desperation, shattered space, and human cost running far beyond the battlefield. And as they pressed further into Germany, they would soon encounter the same devastation not just in cities, but in the quiet emptiness of villages where those same civilians, displaced, exhausted, and hungry, struggled to survive in the aftermath. Encountering civilians in collapse. American units pushing deeper into Bavaria began to move through settlements where the sound of battle had faded, but life had not returned. The villages they entered often lay silent, their streets empty, houses collapsed or abandoned. Then, slowly, people emerged from cellars or doorways carrying white scraps of cloth, ripped bedsheets, scarves, or rags lifted into the air. These were not combatants, not militias waiting in hiding, but families gaunt with hunger, signaling that they posed no threat. For soldiers fresh from days of firefights, these encounters broke the rhythm of war. Instead of shots from a window or smoke tumbling from a mine blast, they found children in torn clothes stepping forward with hands outstretched for food. The American army had rules for such meetings. Non-fraternization had been policy since the push into Germany began, forbidding soldiers from unnecessary contact with locals. Official warnings framed the restriction as both precaution and discipline. No conversation, no trade, and no gestures of familiarity. German civilians, the orders reminded them, could not be trusted. Approaches of surrender, like raised cloth or empty hands, might still mask ambushes or sabotage. Kindness was a liability, one able to undermine morale or blur the essential difference between conqueror and conquered. Yet these principles collided with the unavoidable sight of hunger. Soldiers carrying rations could not unsee the children gathered at verges of roads or elderly villagers too weak to keep standing as columns passed. Some GIs recorded in journals that they gritted their teeth and marched forward, refusing to answer eyes that begged for food. Others quietly disobeyed, slipping scraps of bread into small hands or tossing tins into shadowed doorways. Between order and conscience, each man decided case by case, left to resolve on his own whether the rule of command or the law of need demanded obedience. For those who survived inside these villages, what remained most vivid was not the thunder of artillery, but the hollowness that came afterward. Food had vanished long before the Americans arrived. German forces retreating through rural areas requisitioned livestock, seed grain, and anything usable for fuel. Families had dug potatoes early, scoured stores of dried beans, and traded away bedding in the hope of finding nourishment. By the final weeks, even scraps for soup were scarce. Shelters became places of waiting rather than hiding, where families listened for movement outside. When Americans appeared, the risk of showing themselves carried its own weight. The cloth they held out was not only a mark of surrender, but of identity, a way of insisting they were neither soldier nor saboteur, only the remnants of ordinary life hoping to survive notice. Some accounts by advancing companies describe scenes stark in detail. In one Franconian settlement, patrols found no living well available. Pails hauled up dark, foul water reeking from weeks of neglect. In others, smoke rose not from kitchens, but from furniture torn apart and burned in stoves when nothing else remained to heat the night. Children wore coats pieced together from curtains or scraps of uniforms. Inside houses, doors hung from frames where their wooden panels had been stripped and burned. The collapse, soldiers noted, reached far past command offices or town halls. Daily rhythms, water drawn, bread baked, tools repaired, had ceased to function. Life now depended on salvage, replacement, or repurposing objects never meant to sustain families for weeks in isolation. The collapse was magnified by widespread displacement. Newly catalogued records confirm that in the war's last months, large numbers of civilians in southern Germany were forced from their homes. Families fled bombardments, abandoned villages stripped by retreating German commands, or were driven from their houses during military evacuations. At the same time, streams of refugees from other destroyed regions drifted into Bavaria hoping for shelter. The result was a surge of people in motion, visible on every country road. Carts creaking under bundles, women nesting infants in folds of blankets, and elderly men pressed onward with canes and sticks. Travelers often had no clear destination. They moved because they had been expelled, or because the ruins left behind would not sustain them, or because the next town ahead might yield what the last one lacked. In Franconia, records show that this upheaval brought heavy pressure. The region's position as a transport crossroad and defensive corridor attracted both retreating soldiers and layers of bombing intended to block German supply lines. Villages swelled with strangers, and houses overfilled quickly. Families found themselves sheltering distant kin or sometimes neighbors from entirely different towns, all competing for the same dwindling food and water. Kitchens meant for one household prepared whatever meals remained for 3 or 4. Barns emptied of animals housed the displaced. American patrols encountered locals alongside new arrivals, a confusing swirl where origins no longer mattered, only hunger. Limited reserves vanished as fast as they were discovered, leaving no time for resettled families to stabilize before the next wave joined them. For soldiers passing through this landscape, the sight of constant movement left its mark. They were fighting a war, but also crossing ground where the majority of people held no weapon. Civilians drifted in columns that paralleled the army's own, following carts or staggering on foot. Regulations reminded the troops that their rations belonged to them alone, and yet daily experience brought collapse to the edge of their march. Witnesses recalled the moment when a child fell into the dust as a unit approached, unable to keep walking from exhaustion. Regulations did not erase the reality of his body lying still. Even when bread or water did not change hands, the spectacle of deprivation weighed upon them. The rules existed, but the presence of hunger was undeniable. More than battlefield encounters, these scenes reshaped what the advancing soldiers remembered about the war's closing stage. Official reports listed casualties, sabotage, or cleared positions, but diaries more often mentioned faces glimpsed from cellar doors, eyes deepened by weeks without food, or women clutching infants as they waited by roadside ditches. Every sign that once suggested resistance, the silent house, the closed barn, had to be reconsidered against the possibility that it simply held life waiting for the right signal to crawl out. For American infantry, the terrain that intelligence had described as potentially fortified with guns and fuel depots instead bore traces of desperation, where surrender was rarely military but constantly civilian. The blurring of combat and collapse became more complete with each week. Streets shelled open for armored entry became filled the next day with displaced families scavenging wood. Supply convoys carrying ammunition rolled alongside carts of people carrying the entirety of their belongings. Links between conqueror and conquered bent under the weight of necessity. Hunger and weariness pressed closer together than any directive would allow. Some soldiers began to see their responsibilities less strictly as military alone. Encounters forced them to consider whether victory achieved at the front automatically resolved what waited behind. Reviewing the evidence now available shows that hunger and displacement were not incidental shadows of war, but central elements shaping its end. Southern Germany in the spring of 1945 contained large swathes of population wandering, collapsed infrastructures without safe water, and settlements torn by repeated possession. To live in that environment was to face profound uncertainty, with loyalties dissolved, safety indecipherable, and survival dependent upon improvisation. Civilians woke each day not knowing whether an army would arrive, whether a house would hold shelter, or whether the next meal could be obtained. Soldiers, exhausted from combat, recognized in those faces a different kind of endurance. For the men advancing deeper into Bavaria, the war no longer ended cleanly at the moment ground was secured. Victory came shadowed by starvation and displacement, testing not just discipline but compassion. And as they moved forward, the soldiers were about to confront an even darker reality, one that lay hidden not in villages, but behind heavily guarded gates. The liberation of Dachau. The approach to Dachau began as another advance along the map, one more checkpoint on the road through Bavaria. For the soldiers, the name meant little, and the expectation was simple: some kind of confinement area, perhaps a prisoner of war camp crowded and poorly run. Nothing in their orders prepared them for what they would find when they reached the gates on April 29, 1945. Outwardly, it looked ordinary: rows of fencing, a watchtower, gates of timber and wire. But the impression lasted only as long as the distance to the entrance. The air changed first. Even before seeing detail, soldiers noticed the smell, rich with rot, thick enough to stop conversation. Just inside the yard stood open pits dug hastily, half filled with the bodies of prisoners who had died in the days before. The earth was uneven, limbs protruding, skin grey and thin. Death was no longer a condition of battle measured in bursts of gunfire. Here it was visible as a steady process, relentless and deliberate, left unhidden. On the rail siding beside the camp sat a train of boxcars, abandoned but not empty. Soldiers who opened the doors discovered freight not of supplies or equipment, but corpses stacked tightly together, starved men and women who had not survived the journey. Some still bore striped prisoner uniforms, others the fragments of whatever clothing they had when they were taken. The sight carried its own weight of horror. War had taught these men of explosions, scorched tanks, minefields, and ruined towns. None of that felt like this. Boxcars retrieved from industrial loops, now delivering bodies instead of goods. The camp was not simply military detention. It was something built to end life itself. Inside the perimeter, the scale became clear. Rows of barracks stretched in ordered symmetry, each designed for hundreds but crammed with thousands. Survivors stumbled toward the liberators, their bodies fragile, clothing hanging in tatters, bones evident beneath skin. Some collapsed before they reached the soldiers, unable to muster the strength to stand. Disease ran rampant in the overcrowded rooms, typhus most of all, left uncontained by medical care that had long since disappeared. Medics arriving with the infantry rushed forward, but standard procedures had no place in this environment. Starved bodies could not accept normal rations. Drinking too much water at once could kill. Every action had to be improvised, every step facing the knowledge that supplies and training were far from what was required. For decades, estimates of Dachau's losses circulated in fragments. Records were incomplete, testimonies conflicted, and numbers shifted depending on the source. By 2025, however, newly digitized archives produced the most complete accounting yet. Cross-comparison of Nazi files and Red Cross data confirmed that 206,206 individuals passed through Dachau from its opening to the day of liberation. Among them, 41,561 perished inside its walls. These totals gave weight to what had been immediately overwhelming to those who entered it in 1945. The numbers added structure where the soldiers had only shock. In the moment, no tally mattered, yet the figures ensure that the scale of the atrocity is not lost to debate or approximation. The prisoner population showed the full scope of persecution. Dachau had been used not for one group alone, though Jews endured in large numbers. Political opponents, resistance organizers, Jehovah's Witnesses, clergy, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, and other groups all passed through. Its long existence, it had operated since 1933, gave it a place as a model for the broader system of camps. In Dachau, methods of exploitation, experimentation, and coercion were developed and transferred across occupied Europe. The liberation of this camp therefore revealed not only the ruin of its inmates, but also the larger mechanics of state violence that had run uninterrupted for over a decade. American soldiers meeting the first prisoners described confusion and disbelief. Some ran through surges of anger, turning weapons against captured guards. Others fell silent, unsure how to respond. A few attempted to crack jokes that faltered into quiet. Others wept without restraint. What they discovered could not be aligned with any previous encounter in the war. Forced marches and bombings had cruel sameness. They had context. Dachau broke that system of comprehension. There was no exchange of fire here, only the blunt revelation of what thousands had endured without defense. Film crews sent with the divisions recorded the site almost immediately. Using 16 color stock, they captured imagery few had imagined. Corpses stacked in heaps taller than men, prisoners sitting nearly motionless from exhaustion, soldiers holding scarves to their faces against the stench. These details traveled back to America faster than letters. When screened weeks later, they delivered proof stronger than text could offer. The liberation footage stripped away any possibility of claiming exaggeration. To those who filmed, the act was less about future documentation than about confronting something too immense to contextualize with words. The liberation marked a sudden change of responsibilities. Troops who had trained to advance and secure were now ordered to stabilize a humanitarian disaster. Quarantine zones had to be established to limit disease. Survivor care became central. Feeding stations required careful rationing, as even small misjudgments could unintentionally kill. Field hospitals extended their reach with limited staff. Medical officers spoke of the impossible, confronting thousands in need with resources sized for dozens. The urgency diverted manpower away from frontline advances, but no one could treat it as secondary. The conditions insisted on immediate action. Experience embedded itself deeply in those who witnessed it. Soldiers returned home carrying invisible consequences. Some recorded nightmares, sudden rages, and an inability to discuss the memory aloud. Many more left no words at all, though families recognized shifts in behavior. Years of drinking to excess, sudden tempers, silent refusal to speak of the war. In 2025, medical historians revisited these cases with diagnostic tools unavailable in the 1940s. Their study concluded that roughly 1 in 8 soldiers directly involved in Dachau's liberation displayed long-term trauma matching what modern research defines as post-traumatic stress disorder. Such conditions were unrecognized by wartime medicine, but the patterns now align clearly. Flashbacks, emotional breakdowns, and isolation tied to the moment when they passed through those gates. For history, these findings recast the liberation not merely as discovery, but as moment of lasting psychological impact. To free survivors came with the cost of carrying away what had been seen. Victory in military terms achieved safety, but at personal levels, it etched scenes for which no soldier had been prepared. The day of liberation expanded responsibility. Soldiers became witnesses as well as fighters, caretakers as well as conquerors. Letters home in the weeks after Dachau reveal the shift. Soldiers wrote no longer only of marches and weapons, but of the camp, its odors, its people, and its meaning. The war for them abandoned the idea of armies contesting ground alone. It had become tied to the revelation of a death system guarded inside wire. This change hardened the resolve of some units, instilling determination to push on. For others, it drained morale, leaving them unable to reconcile what they had encountered with the expectation of victory. Yet across all accounts runs a constant thread. Dachau altered the understanding of why the war mattered in its final days. The significance of Dachau endures most of all in this transformation. It showed not just German defeat, but the reality of what that defeat uncovered. The figures, 206 entered, 41,561 dead, provide the dimensions, but the scale extends further into the soldiers' memory and the survivors' lives. For the men who walked through its gates, the confrontation with stripped humanity cut deeper than artillery or ambush. It pressed upon them a weight that grew heavier with distance from the battlefield, following them into civilian life. Dachau's liberation exposed the cruelty of the system it embodied, but it also set in motion consequences for those who found it. The images could be seen by the public, the numbers could be compiled by historians, yet the psychological burden never left the soldiers, shaping them long after parades and medals marked victory. Their bodies had survived the battles, but the memories of Dachau would test endurance in ways war itself had not. The psychological toll on American soldiers. They had come through months of combat, enduring the frozen Ardennes, the street fighting of West German cities, and the endless grind of artillery shells. Many had seen close friends lost in sudden flashes of violence, yet those same men, hardened by frontline experience, faltered when they stepped into Dachau. Combat had offered structure, a visible enemy, a goal of survival and victory. The camp shattered those boundaries. Inside were skeletal prisoners struggling to stand, heaps of clothing taken from the dead, and rail cars packed with corpses. These were not the hazards of battle. They were deliberate, systematic annihilation beyond any framework soldiers had carried with them across Europe. What followed was a storm of wrenching emotions that discipline could not always contain. In the hours after the gates opened, some men admitted they could not sleep, their minds replaying what they had witnessed the moment their eyes closed. Rage boiled to the surface. Survivors described prisoners watching armed guards struck down, some shot on the spot, as GIs lashed out in uncontrolled anger. Reports later confirmed that dozens of captured SS were killed in the reprisal that followed liberation. For others, the fury did not turn outward but inward. Soldiers wrote of standing with full rations in hand, aware of men starving only yards away, and feeling a guilt that could not be soothed. Both impulses, violent reprisal and silent shame, spread through the units, testing discipline in ways that combat itself had not managed to do. When letters began arriving home in the summer of 1945, the struggle was evident but rarely spoken openly. Veterans skirted around direct description. They mentioned smells that clung even after uniforms were washed, shadows on the edge of sleep, or nights spent awake without rest. Few told family members what they had truly seen. Diaries, however, reveal more. Angry outbursts without cause, arguments sparked by trivial details, or sudden hollowness when combat drained away. These personal accounts, stored away in trunks and archives for decades, form the unacknowledged record of what liberation demanded from the soldiers themselves. Public history emphasized triumph. Veterans fell silent. That silence safeguarded the image of victory, but it erased the scars behind it. At the time, there was no language for what these men carried. Military medicine labeled some cases nervous exhaustion or battle fatigue, terms already loosely applied to frontline collapse. But these survivors were not overwhelmed by gunfire or exhaustion in the field. Their breakdowns came in the absence of gunfire, when atrocities confronted them without warning. Long after the front moved forward, the images stayed. Because the condition lacked definition, it remained invisible. They returned home with wounds unmeasured, standing among their peers as though untouched. It took generations before their reactions could be understood in terms that matched their reality. The research released in 2025 made that reality clearer than all earlier attempts. Historians combined sealed case files, medical reports, and family accounts with modern diagnostic standards. This retrospective analysis, impossible at the time, revealed that approximately 1 in 8 men involved directly in the liberation of Dachau developed long-term effects recognizable today as post-traumatic stress disorder. They endured recurring nightmares of the camp, vivid flashbacks at ordinary triggers, and uncontrollable bursts of anger disconnected from circumstance. Others withdrew from family and community life, avoiding reminders of Europe in any form, photographs, gatherings, or even conversations. The percentage was striking, far higher than in US units exposed only to prolonged combat. The numbers confirmed what veterans' families had sensed for decades, that liberation inflicted a unique form of trauma. These outcomes reshaped the picture of American soldiers in 1945. Images of jubilant crowds in recently freed towns, of soldiers returning home as victors, dominated memory. They represented one kind of truth. Yet alongside those public images lived a private history where men could neither celebrate nor forget. Some coped by burying themselves in work. Others turned to alcohol, shielding their families with silence that left children bewildered when anger flared without warning. Arguments over nothing, prolonged sadness that seemed directionless, nights haunted by sleeplessness. These fragments became the inheritance of households across the country. Decades later, interviews with surviving family members described fathers unwilling to recount their service, or only speaking in oblique fragments. The hidden cost of Dachau was carried far beyond the walls of the camp itself. The contradiction becomes stark. Soldiers who survived brutal campaigns, Normandy, the Huchen Forest, Nuremberg, found themselves broken not at the hands of firing enemies, but in the act of entering a place already conquered. Dachau stood as proof that endurance against combat did not equate to immunity from collapse. What confronted them was not the chaos of warfare, but the silence of an industrialized killing system operating outside the soldier's frame of reference. For many, that silence was the most corrosive. It destroyed the categories in which they had made sense of their service. Victories celebrated across nations came to them bound together with scenes they could not place within heroic memory. Such recognition shifts how historians view America's adjustment after war. Publicly, reintegration was cast in banners, medals, and proud speeches. Privately, the war stretched on, its nightmares implanted into domestic routines thousands of miles away. In homes and neighborhoods, families confronted echoes of barbed wire and hunger through the behavior of veterans who had walked through the gates of Dachau. The victory parades moved past with cheering voices, but for some of the men marching, cheers were no longer able to reach memory. These differences complicate the neat image of 1945 as a moment of simple closure. The war ended for nations, but lingered for individuals. Equally significant is the way this experience forces a re-evaluation of strength itself. Morale had long been measured by willingness to fight, by stamina under strain. But Dachau revealed limits that had nothing to do with courage on the battlefield. The camp exposed soldiers to atrocity unmediated by combat, requiring not bravery at a moment of assault, but an impossible level of integration afterward. As the new research shows, many could not achieve it. They carried forward wounds not marked on their bodies, but etched into thought, triggered by smells, by sudden sounds, or by simple silence that recalled the yards behind Dachau's gates. Understanding this with the help of 2025 analysis restores depth to the history of liberation. These were not men simply hardened to every challenge, but individuals who bore unique injuries when atrocity entered their reality. The absence of a recognized diagnosis at the time masked it, but the evidence uncovered now makes plain what was hidden. Their quiet struggles belong to the story of the war just as much as the battles officially recorded. The liberation altered not only history's archive, but the private landscapes of families who inherited its weight. For the soldiers themselves, Dachau inverted what triumph had once meant. It placed victory beside collapse, pride alongside unending memory. The trauma remained unseen in newsreels, but embedded itself in household lives across America. That cost does not erase the larger outcome of 1945, but it forces recognition that liberation inflicted consequences alongside relief. These contradictions define how the war truly ended for those on its front lines. As their units continued to advance, these men carried inner burdens, even as orders directed them forward. The objectives ahead seemed clear enough on maps, bridges, towns, and river crossings to secure, but the context was already shifting. What soldiers experienced privately now stood beside new commands shaped not by combat necessity, but by political calculation. For many, the next sudden change came not from hidden atrocities, but from the decision at the Elbe. For the men still pushing east, the maps showed Berlin within reach, but the unexpected order came down: stop at the Elbe. The capital that seemed only days away would not fall to them. To the soldiers who had fought across Bavaria and Saxony, halting now felt as if their work was unfinished. They had endured countless miles and heavy losses only to watch the last stage assigned to someone else. For the High Command, however, the decision was never about the instincts of infantrymen. It was shaped instead by agreements made months before and by calculations of what it would cost to press further. The Elbe River carried not only the flow of spring melt, but also the force of diplomacy. At Yalta earlier that year, Allied leaders had already agreed that Berlin lay in the Soviet zone of operations. By April 1945, Red Army forces were already embroiled in the ruinous battle for that city, advancing through streets block by block with staggering losses. Dwight Eisenhower, overseeing the Allied Expeditionary Force, made the decision that American troops would not attempt to seize Berlin. In the reports available at the time, and in the assessments confirmed again by later researchers, Eisenhower emphasized that Berlin was not a military objective, but a political one. Omar Bradley estimated American losses might reach 100,000 if US forces pushed into the capital. With Germany broken and its armies collapsing across every front, such casualties could not be justified. The Reich was already finished. Pursuing prestige at that moment, Eisenhower reasoned, would mean exchanging lives for symbolism. This pragmatism was clear at the strategic level. Yet on the ground, soldiers looking across the river could not interpret politics with the same frankness. They saw bridges not yet destroyed, open roads stretched beyond, and a capital waiting only a short march ahead. Prisoners streamed into American lines by the thousands each day, further feeding the impression that German resistance was crumbling all the way to the heart of Hitler's city. Many GIs expected to move forward in a final advance. The sudden order to halt struck them as arbitrary. Their diaries describe restlessness, disbelief, and bitterness. Some openly admitted their anger at being denied the chance to be the ones who ended it in Berlin. To them, history would credit others with closing the war they had fought to the threshold of victory. The depth of that disappointment became sharper once news confirmed that Soviet flags now flew over Berlin's government buildings. Few American soldiers had heard details of the Yalta agreements. They measured battles by terrain gained and lives lost, not by diplomatic chance. Watching the Soviets claim the symbolic final triumph, many felt that their sacrifices had been eclipsed. Letters written home in May 1945 speak of a lingering sense that the US Army, despite its victories, had been held back at the edge of the decisive moment. Veterans later remembered that frustration as a defining feature of their service, that they had been stopped not by the enemy, but by a line on a map. To Eisenhower and other Allied leaders, the Elbe represented more than a boundary of advance. It was a safeguard against lethal misunderstandings. Reports warned that if American patrols crossed too far into Soviet-assigned territory, they risked unplanned firefights with Russian units. Both armies had endured relentless warfare against Germany, and miscommunication could easily spark accidental clashes. Building bridges across the Elbe was permitted only for limited use. Broader movement east was prohibited. Instead, the two forces met formally at designated crossing points. The scenes of handshake and celebration that followed became iconic, American and Soviet soldiers embracing, exchanging tokens, and sharing drinks. Photographers and film crews presented the encounter as the emblem of Allied unity, the visible proof of partnership in victory. With the distance of decades, that image appears more complicated. Archival records reveal how much calculation stood beneath the celebration. The meeting at the Elbe did mark the peak of wartime cooperation, but it also revealed the new divisions already forming. Germany had ceased to be a battlefield contested daily and became, at that moment, a space carved into occupation zones. The Elbe was less a passing landmark than the physical boundary where future rivalry began to take shape. For one brief day, cameras captured unity. In reality, what had been marked on a conference map now existed on the ground, the first drawn line of Europe's coming division. For those camped west of the river, none of this future was visible. Their tasks shifted away from assault to patrols, prisoner processing, and civilian management. Victory, so close at hand, now required steady waiting rather than aggressive action. Morale, once tied to constant movement forward, weakened under the suspension. Correspondence from even seasoned officers reveals a trend: enthusiasm replaced by restlessness, and restlessness sliding into quiet frustration. They had imagined history recording their march through Berlin. Instead, their reality was to dig positions that would likely never be used in combat. The release of internal communications in 2025 sharpened the understanding of Eisenhower's reasoning. They confirm how deliberate the choice had been. He considered Berlin too costly and objective, measured not in logistics, but in human lives. At the same time, the cables note his strict adherence to the Yalta settlements. America would not take ground promised to an ally, even if it meant deferring the symbolic capture of the enemy's capital. The war was already certain in outcome. The decision was to shorten suffering for his men by halting at the Elbe, even at the price of letting the Soviets seize the final moment of triumph. Historians now mark this calculation as the first turning point from Allied warfare into geopolitical rivalry. The cease in advance created the zones of control that became the 4 occupation sectors, which swiftly hardened into patterns of influence. Within weeks, disputes over transport routes, displaced civilians, and control of resources surfaced between the American and Soviet commands. To the soldiers on the riverbanks, these were invisible developments. For them, the Elbe meant an unfinished campaign. In hindsight, it was the opening framework of the Cold War. For those writing the history of the war, the halt does not represent weakness, but instead reveals the weight carried by political boundaries. The soldiers' perspective was drawn from battles won. Command decisions reflected the broader reality of alliances, costs, and post-war arrangements. The clash between those two viewpoints, between lived sacrifice and geopolitical necessity, was embodied at the Elbe. There the visible war receded, and the first outlines of the confrontation that would shape the next half-century emerged. The handshake across the river would be remembered as a symbol of Allied victory. Yet the same line of water also became the earliest marker of division. To the men who stopped there, uncertain why their advance had ended, it was one more struggle to reconcile sacrifice with outcome. And as they stood along the riverbanks, new responsibilities arose that would test both cooperation and the uneasy beginnings of distrust. Working with the Soviets. The Americans gathering along the Elbe in April 1945 expected a defining encounter. On the far bank, across makeshift bridges and under spring skies, stood the Soviet forces whose drive from the east had already carried them into the ruins of Berlin. This was no ordinary link-up. For weeks, news bulletins had primed the soldiers to expect handshakes and official ceremonies that would signal not just victory over Germany, but the confirmation of a global alliance. Yet when US infantrymen and Soviet troops finally came face to face, the moment carried more than simple relief. It combined celebration with unease. Cameras quickly captured the staged unity. Smiling GIs and Soviet soldiers clasped hands, lifted each other onto shoulders, and traded regimental insignia. Bottles of spirits appeared, scavenged from nearby villages, and toasts to victory resounded in languages pieced together with gestures as much as words. Film crews recorded images of genuine excitement, the relief of armies meeting after years of fighting toward each other without pause. These photographs and newsreels circulated almost immediately to Allied publics, who saw them as proof that the alliance of East and West was unshakable. For many Americans back home, the sight reassured them that the sacrifices of war had brought unity between nations that once seemed impossibly distant. Yet those who stood away from the cameras reported a more complicated impression. Officers on both sides noted subtle tensions beneath the surface. Soviet commanders spoke possessively of territory captured, describing it as already belonging to them, while American officers worried whether boundaries marked by conferences months earlier could truly hold in practice. American patrol leaders remarked upon the severity of Soviet treatment of German civilians and prisoners, a severity far beyond what US soldiers had grown accustomed to enforcing. Conversations were brief and strained as soldiers exchanged cigarettes or souvenirs, but found few words that bridged the gap of language or experience. For decades, details of those first days along the Elbe survived mostly in memoirs and scattered reminiscences, leaving the impression of a surface unity untroubled by deeper strains. The release of archival material in 2025 changed that view, showing clearly that mistrust began in those very hours of contact, even as formal ceremonies projected harmony. Reports confirm that small disputes arose almost immediately, troops straying across boundaries, disagreements over access to roads or stockpiles, and rival claims over captured materials. None amounted to open confrontation, but they revealed how fragile the cooperative spirit was. What the records emphasize is that discipline and diplomacy contained these tensions, but they did not remove them. American soldiers were struck as much by contrast as by familiarity. They had imagined Soviet allies would resemble them at least in morale and daily habits, but encounters often underscored differences. Soviet uniforms looked improvised after years of brutal campaigns, and their equipment carried visible scars from far longer service. Their manner toward prisoners could be harsh, and heavy drinking appeared to many GIs a common feature of meetings. The enthusiasm broadcast in photographs was real enough, but behind it lived an unease, a sobering recognition that the alliance was both essential and temporary. Commanders on both sides understood the dividing line for what it was, a frontier, not just a meeting ground. The Elbe crossing was more than a coincidence of timing. It reflected binding agreements reached at Yalta earlier in the year, which had carved Germany into distinct occupation zones. For ordinary GIs, the river looked no different than others crossed since France. For their leaders, every bridge and checkpoint along its banks represented a new reality of divided administration. The British and American planners had long crafted the geography of these zones. Now that plan took on physical form. The river became the border where Germany's future governance was being set in motion months before formal surrender. Civilians in the surrounding towns felt the cost of this double presence. Villages already emptied by bombardment and retreat endured repeated dislocation as Soviet and American authorities imposed overlapping demands. Supplies were requisitioned, families pushed into new labor, and transport resources stripped for military use. Daily survival required negotiating two systems of rules at once, with little chance for appeal. To soldiers, it was a frustrating image of order precariously maintained. To civilians, it was another layer of hardship after years of exhaustion. The uneasiness at the Elbe casts new light on later assumptions about the Cold War. Histories often describe mistrust growing only after the shared purpose of defeating Germany was achieved. Yet contemporary documents now show that suspicion and rivalry existed even as victory was being celebrated. The outward handshake concealed a current of calculation that neither side ignored. American soldiers could sense it in stern Soviet faces and in the tone of conversations that circled back again and again to territory. They could feel it when rail lines were contested or when Soviets insisted upon rights of use that Americans believed should be shared. These were not overt hostilities, but they were early indicators of where cooperation would falter. The symbolism of the meeting at the Elbe, therefore, bore two meanings at once. International audiences saw an image of unity strong enough to carry into lasting peace. Beneath that image was the quiet drawing of a line that would define the coming decades. For US soldiers, the duality was memorable. They had participated in a celebration they knew was sincere, yet they carried with them the unease of observing an ally who already treated the river as a border to be guarded. Their experience pressed together camaraderie and caution, joy and restraint, within the space of a single day. By the time American soldiers rotated out of their riverside posts, habits had been set that foreshadowed the era ahead. Separate command decisions governed civilian requests, requisitioning policies, and control of transport. Shared commissions existed, but they documented disagreements as frequently as they produced resolutions. Each side walked away with its own conclusions. Cooperation held because defeat of Germany demanded it, yet the scaffolding of division was already in place. The handshake that symbolized Allied unity was also the moment that placed a firm frontier between East and West. Returning soldiers later reflected that the photographs from April 1945 felt incomplete. The smiles they carried at the river's edge were genuine, but they had been accompanied by silent calculation, fragmented communication, and the realization that unity was narrower than the newsreels suggested. The world celebrated images of men raising glasses together, but some veterans recalled vividly how they had left the Elbe with suspicions of what would follow once Germany's surrender was secure. The release of long-sealed documents clarifies these impressions. The Elbe was indeed a triumph, but it was also a fracture visible from the start. American and Soviet soldiers stood together, but behind them, their commanders and governments measured influence, resources, and geography that were already diverging. The celebrations broadcast to the world highlight joy, but the private accounts confirm that mistrust surfaced instantly, eroding the simpler story of unity. That divide, once laid down at the riverbank, would soon harden into the geopolitics of the second half of the century. And for the Americans now pausing along the water, the change was immediate. Once celebrations ended, their role transformed from advancing fighters into occupiers. Instead of marching eastward, they now faced the task of maintaining authority, managing civilians, and stabilizing a countryside left without order. What had begun as a military campaign was shifting into a test of governance amid collapse, demanding skills and responsibilities far removed from what soldiers had trained to deliver. Occupation, logistics, and order. How could American soldiers take responsibility for a society that had effectively dissolved overnight? In late April 1945, US units stepping into Bavarian towns and Franconian cities no longer faced fortified positions or lines of defense. Instead, they met streets emptied of authority. Police departments had abandoned their offices, courts had vanished without trace, and local councils no longer functioned. Banks lay closed, stores sat stripped bare, and power stations or water plants had been destroyed in bombardments. To the victors, there was no structured administration to work with, only hungry civilians uncertain whether they were regarded as former enemies, potential collaborators, or victims. Victory in combat quickly revealed itself as only half the problem. The other half was creating immediate order from near total collapse. The broken infrastructure impressed itself most starkly. The electrical network had disintegrated under bombing raids. Water lines fractured with each destroyed bridge and pumping station. Gas service, once widespread in urban centers, had already collapsed after repeated shortages. Hospitals functioned minimally, with stocks of morphine and antibiotics exhausted. Americans entering these facilities found wards lined with untreated infections, gangrenous wounds, and starving patients who had waited weeks without meaningful care. Civil defense workers, once tasked with limited recovery after air raids, disappeared with the retreat of Nazi officials. Into this void walked young soldiers who had expected to fight a final battle, only to be pressed into running the essential services of a society no longer capable of supporting itself. For civilians, survival showed absence at its most basic. Shelves, where shops still stood, were stripped clean. Farmers had little grain left after years of forced requisition. With official currency rendered almost meaningless, barter became the standard. Jewelry traded for stale bread, furniture for a few liters of fuel, scraps of cloth for firewood lunged from ruins. Civil police were gone. Crime filled the gap, organized gangs searching abandoned houses for valuables, desperate families stealing food from the same allies feeding them. Without German authority and with no functioning economy, the American presence became both protector and provider. The magnitude of this responsibility only later came into full relief. In 2025, researchers examining long-classified US Army logistics files tracked the vast scale of resources redirected into occupied Germany. What they revealed was staggering. American forces had to feed entire cities almost overnight. Millions of meals were being issued each day from US Army stocks, far beyond the numbers earlier histories suggested. Troops who once carried shells and rations for combat now served as quartermasters for hungry populations. Divisions that had been trained for military maneuvers were suddenly converted into administrators, facing the logistical demands of sustaining societies as large as major US metropolitan centers. The process depended on both improvisation and sheer scale. Field kitchens were hastily erected in public squares, with army cooks ladling soup and bread made from flour and condensed milk redirected from depots across France and Belgium. Long queues developed outside these makeshift canteens, civilians waiting in silence with bowls, pots, or battered tins. Soldiers noted the resemblance not to towns under Allied authority, but to refugee camps in which entire families survived only from daily rations. Military trucks once packed with ammunition now rolled across bridges, carrying potatoes, flour, and vegetable oil. Guards had to be posted in many locations to keep crowds from surging forward in desperation. Security, inseparable from survival, became the next imperative. The question of policing lingered heavily. Orders required the disarmament of all German policemen until each could be vetted for Nazi Party or SS membership. The practical result was entire weeks without a functioning local law enforcement body. Until investigations concluded, American military police filled the void. They stood at crossroads directing traffic, broke up brawls when food lines erupted into panic, enforced curfews, and attempted to keep civilian life within some recognizable order. Exhaustion pressed hard. Men who had fought through the Ardennes or Nuremberg were now reshaping their days around patrols, paperwork, and dispute mediation. Their work carried the weight of authority, but rarely the clarity of military command. The tasks created contradictions that soldiers struggled to reconcile. Helmets, rifles, and hardened routines defined their presence, but what they encountered daily were civilians rummaging ruins for firewood or children shadowing them in columns praying for a scrap of bread. Standing orders warned them against forming personal bonds with civilians. Every interaction needed to preserve discipline, sustain the image of authority, and avoid complacency against potential resistance. Yet hunger, exhaustion, and desperation intruded constantly. Soldiers described patrols that began with weapons searches ending in food distribution, or security assignments at railway yards dissolving into guard duty for ration deliveries. That blurred line between conqueror and caretaker was sharpened by the scale of supply. Military logistics, designed to move weapon systems forward, were rapidly repurposed for humanitarian load. Warehouses offloaded grain instead of artillery. Trains patched together by army engineers pulled relief shipments east instead of armored vehicles. Ships that had crossed the Atlantic months earlier laden with ordnance now carried cases of dried milk and medical stock. Even with planning underway for possible redeployment to the Pacific Campaign, military hierarchies devoted significant manpower to sustaining German civilians. Without that reallocation, famine would have exploded in the first weeks after surrender. Yet every act of provision balanced uneasily with the enforcement of control. Civilians subject to curfews watched young American soldiers standing guard outside city squares. Families newly displaced were forced to surrender horses, carts, or fuel to requisitioning orders. Military police quarantined some buildings to prevent spread of disease, barring inhabitants from re-entering homes reduced to shells. German families petitioned occupying forces daily with accounts of missing relatives, looted houses, or farm animals seized during bombardment. Language barriers crippled these interactions, with soldiers often dependent upon interpreters cobbled from prison camps or schools. The gap between combat training and everyday requirements for running a crumbling urban order never closed. Still, the system of daily meals, patrols, and makeshift administration prevented outright collapse. American soldiers embodied not only martial victory, but the semblance of local governance. They slept in requisition schools, stood posts near bridges and crossroads, and presided over a kind of emergency order where lines at feeding stations were as central to daily control as guard towers had once been. The challenge was not enforcement of Nazi law or the reanimation of civic tradition. It was keeping society on bare subsistence long enough to prevent starvation from claiming more lives than the war itself. This experience underscored how much of victory was no longer military. American soldiers, who had imagined their war ending after battles in rubble-strewn cities, now performed tasks that bore the character of municipal governance. They bridged gaps between famine and supply, silence and order, empty administrations and wary civilians. Improvisation became the key to daily life, converting combat units into administrations in uniform. The lessons of those first weeks confirmed that the fall of a regime did not alone end conflict. It left behind shattered systems that required immediate rebuilding. Soldiers faced an unfamiliar task, not simply defeating enemies, but controlling space where authority had evaporated overnight. Each step forward required judgment not captured in field manuals, as every act, rationed bread, restored water, guarded intersection, decided whether civilians survived another day. Stabilizing occupied Germany revealed itself as the most urgent responsibility. Ensuring order in the absence of any functioning local authority offered only short-term relief. The deeper question loomed: whether a society that had initiated vast destruction could be reconstructed at all while ruins still marked its landscape. The answers to that problem would define what came next. Beginning the reconstruction. Reconstruction began under uncertain skies, with American soldiers stepping into towns and cities where authority had collapsed and daily life ran on desperation. By May of 1945, the German state no longer issued orders, but rumors whispered through the ruins that its loyalists might continue the struggle underground. Civilians spoke of werewolf groups, secret Nazi partisans who would strike from the dark, sabotaging bridges, assassinating officers, and punishing collaborators. German propaganda in the war's final months had even promised this hidden resistance, and Allied planners braced for ambushes long after the surrender. In villages, soldiers eyed empty windows and shadowed alleys with suspicion, uncertain whether snipers or saboteurs might appear at night. What unfolded in the weeks that followed proved different than expected. Newly reassessed occupation records, confirmed through files opened in 2025, show that the feared werewolf insurgency never amounted to a major threat. Incidents did occur, isolated acts of sabotage, theft, or small-scale attacks directed at supply lines, but their number was far lower than the army had anticipated. Instead of a nationwide partisan war, the violence reflected local collapse rather than organized Nazi resistance. Most US divisions reported that encounters with German civilians brought hunger, not hostility. The specter of insurgency had loomed large in planning documents, yet in reality, the Americans found their greatest challenge not in combat, but in rebuilding the infrastructure that had been systematically dismantled by bombings, retreating German forces, and months of neglect. This shift altered the mission almost overnight. Units organized originally for counterinsurgency patrols pivoted into construction details. Soldiers kept rifles on shoulder, but carried shovels and hammers in hand. Engineers began mapping the scale of the destruction block by block, recording collapsed bridges, torn-up railways, ruined water lines, and gutted electrical stations. The data filled thousands of pages, each line capturing another failure that demanded repair. Railroads in particular showed devastation across the occupation zone. Entire sections had been blown apart during the German withdrawal, with wooden ties uprooted, tracks cut, and locomotives destroyed or seized. Moving food, medicine, or even soldiers now depended on trucks driving along cratered roads, their tires shredded by debris. American engineers improvised solutions. Timber trestles and steel beams salvaged from depots were thrown across rivers to replace collapsed bridges. Civilians were gathered, not as guerrillas, but as laborers desperate for work or food, and were pressed into clearing rubble and laying track under military supervision. Each repaired stretch of rail meant shorter convoys and faster supply. Every functioning bridge reduced the chance of starvation in the communities beyond. Reconstruction had become logistics at its most basic, restoring the lines of movement without which no relief could reach the people clinging to survival in towns and villages. Electric power posed an equally pressing crisis. Cities across southern Germany had depended on stations that lay shattered after years of air raids. Some plants stood gutted, their turbines destroyed beyond recognition. Substations had been flattened, wiring torn loose in tangled masses. Improvised solutions were the only ones available. Army technicians and engineers hauled in transportable generators, setting them up in open squares or commandeered buildings. They produced minimal current, enough to run a local pumping station or to light a hospital ward. Soldiers often shared a single generator line with nearby civilians, barracks wired to the same source as the town's clinic or church. Though meager, these arrangements gave towns a fragile sense of stability. In the stark silence of blackout nights, even a dim glow from a hospital window represented progress. Reconstruction was uneven. American forces soon realized that some cities were beyond any quick repair. Nuremberg and Wurzburg, gutted by firebombing, bore centers reduced to landscapes where maps no longer matched physical space. Street signs buried under rubble, whole blocks reduced to dust. Bulldozers carved rough tracks to permit food trucks to get through. Cranes salvaged usable materials from mountainous wreckage, while civilians stacked bricks stripped of mortar to fashion crude walls for temporary homes. The American role here was less about reconstruction than stabilization, clearing lanes, cordoning dangerous ruins, and ensuring that aid could be delivered at all. Smaller towns endured another form of crisis. Many had escaped the full level of damage seen in the larger cities, yet their intact streets filled with refugees. Families arrived in streams, carrying what they could in carts or on foot. A settlement built for 2,000 now faced 4,000, and within weeks the wells had turned foul under the pressure of overcrowding. Diseases threatened to spread. To confront this, the army's sanitary detachments treated water with chlorine, dug latrines on the village outskirts, and enforced rules to hold back outbreaks of typhus and dysentery. Reconstruction here was not about buildings, but about survival on a communal scale. Without medical action and makeshift sanitation, starvation would have been followed by epidemics. The fear of violent resistance did not disappear immediately. Soldiers were ordered to interrogate civilians, report strange behavior, and remain ready for attacks at any hour. But as weeks stretched with little more than thefts, vandalism, or petty disputes, attitudes softened. The stories of werewolves persisted in gossip, but their presence proved more imagined than real. American patrols found instead families who asked for clean water, villagers who surrendered what little they had in exchange for ration slips, and children who crept closer to test whether soldiers might share bread. Local leadership often fell to individuals who had never held official office, clergymen guiding their congregations, teachers protecting groups of children, and elders gathering families together in emergencies. Nazi officials had either fled or been detained, leaving communal resilience to rise from the fragments. The newly opened records from 2025 sharpen the picture of what reconstruction demanded. They underscore the contrast between expectations and reality. While the feared guerrilla campaign never materialized in force, logistical hurdles proved overwhelming. In one set of files, figures list tens of thousands of broken or impassable infrastructure points across the American zone. Rail links severed, roads washed out, bridges collapsed, and entire power stations offline. Engineers' notes read as dry technical summaries, but each line represented decisions that shaped daily survival. Repairing a bridge was not simply a matter of moving girders, but of reconnecting farms to markets, hospitals to supply depots, and towns to water sources. In these reports, progress was measured less by geography than by function. A successful operation meant potable water where none had flowed, a path through rubble where none had existed, or the movement of coal trains into towns where people had burned furniture to stay warm. Soldiers read off measurements of spans and beams, but their work marked a vital transition. They were no longer advancing on battle maps. They were advancing in the flicker of light bulbs newly wired to rescue generators, and in the sound of the first, repaired trains moving across opened lines. The slow grind of reconstruction seldom made headlines. Photographs sent home continued to favor images of victory banners and soldiers celebrated upon their return. The men who pulled girders into place or cleared bodies from the ravines of ruined bridges rarely appeared in those reels. Yet their work determined whether civilians lived or died in the fragile calm that followed war. In truth, the silent enemies they faced were less dramatic but equally lethal: hunger, illness, and exposure. These forces did not surrender on May 8th. They lingered in every hollowed street, waiting unless the occupying forces fought them back with shovels, trucks, and rations. The efforts of those first weeks showed that reconstruction was not a single operation, but a constant sequence of improvisations, each one buying a little more time for a population on edge. Disease could erupt at any moment. Starvation could return before harvests recovered. The calm of daylight concealed unease just beneath the surface. The war's destruction had ended with surrender, but the fractures it carved into families, communities, and entire regions revealed themselves only as life limped forward into uneasy peace. As American soldiers shifted from combat roles to the work of rebuilding, the outward signs of war's end came into focus: victory parades, flags raised, proclamations of peace. But behind those celebrations, deeper legacies remained, carried both by the civilians living among the ruins and by the veterans still struggling with what they had endured. The next phase was no longer about winning territory, but about measuring the shadow that survival itself would cast. Long-term consequences. When fighting ended in May 1945, parades and proclamations declared the return of peace. Flags unfurled, bands filled the streets with music, and crowds celebrated the defeat of a regime that had plunged Europe into catastrophe. For many, especially in the United States, these scenes suggested a clear division between war and peace, as if sacrifice could now be set aside and life restored to its former course. In hindsight, the reality was different. The decades that followed made plain that while the violence had stopped, the war's consequences had only just begun to unfold, leaving marks on societies and individuals that endured far longer than anyone expected in that spring of triumph. Across Germany, civilians confronted stark uncertainty. Millions had been displaced by bombings, forced evacuations, or the sudden rush of the front lines. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to piles of masonry. Families gathered what belongings they could carry and settled in barns, gutted schools, or camps hastily improvised from available shelters. With water supplies unreliable, basic sanitation absent, and food scarce, illness spread in crowded conditions. Children faced constant hunger and repeated outbreaks of disease, while parents struggled with grief from relatives who had never returned. Even though German armies had surrendered, the sense of dislocation did not vanish. It remained daily life for years after the fighting stopped, shaping the patterns of entire communities. For American veterans, the end of service did not mean freedom from the war's weight. Some had obvious physical injuries, scars, missing limbs, deafness from shell fire. But for many, the more lasting wounds were invisible. They had fought in ambush-strewn forests, crossed landscapes filled with the debris of retreat, or walked through the gates of Dachau. Returning to ordinary life, they often chose silence. They gave only vague accounts when family asked about the war, reluctant to describe what they had seen. Yet that silence did not ensure peace at home. Insomnia, sudden outbursts, restless pacing, and emotional distance interrupted family life across the United States. What wartime medicine had labeled combat fatigue was later reclassified under the framework of post-traumatic stress disorder. When researchers in recent decades analyzed letters, diaries, and records with this lens, they discovered how severe and widespread the strain truly was among men who had faced heavy combat or who had participated in camp liberations. The evidence available in 2025 goes further, showing that trauma did not stop with those who fought. It seeped into households and influenced the lives of their children. New intergenerational studies confirm that veterans struggling with nightmares, avoidance of social contact, and unpredictable anger carried those burdens into ordinary family routines. Their children grew up sensing the tension that could not be explained, learning to navigate silences or temper that surfaced without warning. In interviews spanning several decades, these children described how the war shaped their home life, even though they themselves had been born years after it ended. Anxiety levels ran higher, patterns of instability appeared more common, and a climate of withheld memory unsettled their upbringing. The conflict reached into generations who had not existed in 1945, carried not overtly, but in gestures, moods, and buried memories. German families bore a different legacy, but one no less profound. For a whole generation of children, the backdrop of early life was ruined cities, collapsed streets, and the perpetual hunger of shortages. They measured their world not in milestones of growth, but in the absence of essentials. Missing food, missing security, missing fathers taken to war or sacrificed in its last days. Demographic reconstructions confirm that vast cohorts were raised with limited nutrition, poorly functioning medical care, and near-constant exposure to displacement and loss. Psychologists observing these children in the post-war decades found higher rates of insecurity, difficulty with attachment, and persistent anxiety. These were not failings inherent in the individuals. They were the direct residue of growing up in an environment transformed by destruction. Beyond personal loss, the global political climate hardened in ways that magnified trauma. While the Elbe meetings in April 1945 had offered images of cooperation, they in fact set the line from which post-war rivalry quickly spread. Within a short time, zones of occupation hardened into spheres of influence. Protocols meant for temporary stability became the blueprint of a divided Germany. For American soldiers once cheered as liberators, garrison duty turned into long-term patrols against a new adversary. Once allies, the Soviets became competitors, and the burden of standing guard in a fractured Europe became a permanent commitment. In just a few years, the Cold War absorbed the legacy of the Second World War into a structure of confrontation that stretched across decades. The migration of displaced groups reinforced these divisions. Entire populations uprooted from eastern regions or expelled from former German territories poured into the Allied zones. West German camps held families awaiting resettlement for years, and records show that even into the 1950s, these facilities persisted as makeshift communities. Their presence redrew maps of population in permanent ways, embedding the scars of the war into daily life long after surrender. For the individuals within, survival blended with waiting. They lived in a limbo that testified how the burdens of war extended deeply into the supposed peace. In the United States, veterans confronted their own test of reintegration. Some rebuilt careers and carved new lives, but many experienced difficulties. Fits of sudden anger, retreat from community, or lack of concentration. Such behavior seldom appeared in public acknowledgement of the war. National narratives preferred the language of achievement and triumph. But within households, the contrast was clear. Families witnessed the weight their returning fathers carried, though explanations were rarely offered. Oral histories collected decades later laid bare the gap between the public sense of victory and the private struggles of those who had endured the front lines. The new research of 2025 deepens that recognition, confirming how deeply silence and psychological pain patterned family life for generations afterward. This intersection of triumph and burden defines the paradox of war's ending. The Allied victory destroyed a murderous system and opened paths toward reconciliation over time. Yet for those who lived through the final months, peace was never simple. German civilians stood amid collapsed cities and fractured families, their children marked by hunger and instability. American soldiers returned triumphant in the world's eyes, but quietly shared homes with shadows their families could not always understand. In both societies, lives were reshaped by experiences that refused to fade with time. Archival research, released in 2025, underscores that the endurance of trauma must be placed alongside accounts of triumph. Struggles with memory, anxiety, and silence were not isolated to individuals who fought or survived camps. Their effects outlasted them, leaving marks upon children, grandchildren, and communities adapting long after. The ceremonial end of war in 1945 disguised these realities, but the passage of years reveals clearly that the guns falling silent did not resolve the deeper costs. The enduring truth becomes hard to overlook. What ended in 1945 was only the armed conflict. What followed was a prolonged reckoning with dislocation, division, and inherited psychological strain. The world that emerged carried both the banners of victory and the scars of memory, each defining the generations that came thereafter. This recognition sharpens how we understand the weight of 1945. The legacies of ruin, trauma, and rivalry remained present long after the terms of surrender were signed. They remind us that the war's end was also a transformation into new responsibilities, reshaping both soldiers and societies far beyond the battlefield. The close of the war offered celebration, but it also exposed new demands. For American troops, 1945 did not mean a simple return home. It meant managing food supplies, stabilizing ruined towns, and guarding the frontiers that signaled a divided Europe. The destruction they had endured and the responsibilities suddenly placed upon them remained long after medals were awarded and banners lowered. What they carried back shaped how we now understand trauma, resilience, and responsibility. Through their eyes, victory emerges as both achievement and burden. In those closing weeks grew the outlines of the world that followed.